Giordano Bruno. In February 1600, a former Dominican friar was led into the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, his tongue clamped in an iron device to prevent him from speaking to the crowd, and he was burned alive. And the specific reason his tongue was clamped was that the last time a heretic had been executed in that square, the crowd had been so moved by his final speech that it had created a political problem for the church, and the institution burning Giordano Bruno understood that his words were more dangerous than his body. And what Bruno had said, that required his tongue to be clamped and his body to be burned, was not primarily theological heresy in the conventional sense, but something the institutional church found more specifically threatening, which was a cosmological model derived from his study of Hermetic philosophy that described an infinite universe with no center and no edge, containing infinite worlds, each potentially inhabited. And this model, which Bruno had been teaching and publishing across Europe for 20 years, was derived not from astronomical observation, but from philosophical reasoning. And it was correct. And the universe is infinite and contains billions of worlds, and the Earth is not its center. And Giordano Bruno arrived at this conclusion in the 16th century through a combination of Hermetic philosophical reasoning and a careful reading of Copernicus, and was burned for it. And what makes Bruno's case historically significant is not simply that he was right about the universe, but that the institution that burned him understood at some level that he might be right. Because the specific charge that produced his execution after 8 years of imprisonment and interrogation was not astronomical heresy, but his refusal to recant, his insistence that what he had said about the universe was true, and an institution that was confident in its own cosmological position would not have needed 8 years to break one philosopher. And before you go to the next person on this list, if what you just heard made you want to know more, then subscribe right now, because this channel is built around exactly this: the people who were right and were destroyed for it. And there are 9 more of them, and they are all going to hit harder than the last. Now, Michael Servetus. In 1553, a Spanish physician and theologian was burned alive in Geneva on the orders of John Calvin. And the specific irony of his execution is that he was burned by the Protestant reformers who were themselves being persecuted by the Catholic Church for challenging institutional religious authority. And what Servetus had done was challenge Calvin's theological authority in the same way that Calvin had challenged the popes, which is that he had read the primary texts and arrived at conclusions that the established institutional framework could not accommodate. And the conclusions he arrived at were 2. First, that the doctrine of the Trinity as formulated by the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was not supported by the biblical text and was a later institutional addition to a simpler original Christianity. And second, and more significantly for the history of science, that the blood did not move through the body the way Galen's ancient medical model described, but circulated through the lungs in a process he called pulmonary circulation. And Michael Servetus described the pulmonary circulation of the blood in a theological text published in 1553. And William Harvey is credited with discovering the circulation of the blood in 1628, 75 years after Servetus described pulmonary circulation and was burned for it. And the specific detail that makes this historically extraordinary is that Servetus described his discovery in a theological text rather than a medical one, because the theological text was the context in which he was working, and the medical observation was incidental to his theological argument, which means that one of the most significant discoveries in the history of medicine appeared as a footnote in a theological argument, and the man who made it was burned before anyone could properly evaluate it. Now, John Hus. In 1415, a Czech theologian was burned at the Council of Constance after being guaranteed safe conduct to attend it by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, and the safe conduct was revoked on the grounds that promises made to heretics were not binding. And what John Hus had argued in the century before Luther was almost exactly what Luther would argue 100 years later: that the Church had departed from the teachings of Scripture, that the sale of indulgences was corrupt, that the papacy had accumulated secular power that the original Church had not possessed, and that individual Christians had a responsibility to their own conscience that the institutional church could not override. And Luther's Reformation is remembered as the beginning of a new era, and Jan Hus's identical arguments 100 years earlier are remembered as a heresy, because the political and military circumstances of the two moments were different. Because Luther had the protection of German princes who had economic and political reasons to support his challenge to papal authority, and Hus had no equivalent protection. And the Council of Constance that burned Hus was the same council that had been assembled to resolve the Western Schism, the period in which three men simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate pope, which means that the institution that burned Jan Hus for saying the church was corrupt was itself in the middle of the most visible demonstration of institutional corruption in its history. Now Hypatia of Alexandria. In 415 AD, a woman who was the most accomplished mathematician and astronomer in Alexandria was dragged from her carriage by a Christian mob, stripped, murdered with roof tiles, and her body burned. And the specific reason she was killed was that she was a pagan philosopher with significant political influence over the Roman prefect Orestes, who was in conflict with the bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, and Cyril needed Orestes isolated from his most influential advisor, and the mob that killed Hypatia was connected to Cyril's political network. And what Hypatia had actually been doing before her death was preserving and extending the mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the Alexandrian tradition, commenting on Diophantus and Apollonius and Ptolemy, teaching students who came from across the Mediterranean world, and maintaining the intellectual tradition of the Musion at a moment when that tradition was under enormous pressure from the institutional Christianity that was systematically dismantling the pagan intellectual infrastructure of late antique Alexandria. And Hypatia is the most famous victim of that dismantling, not because her case was the most extreme, but because her intellectual achievements were sufficiently documented to make her erasure visible across the centuries. And the church father Cyril, who organized, or at minimum facilitated her murder, was subsequently declared a saint and a doctor of the church, and those honors have never been revoked, despite the documentary evidence connecting him to her death. Now William Tyndale. In 1536, an English scholar was strangled and burned in the Netherlands, and the specific reason he was killed was that he had translated the Bible into English, had made the primary text of Christianity accessible to ordinary English people who could not read Latin, and had thereby removed the institutional church from its position as the necessary intermediary between the believer and the sacred text. And Tyndale understood exactly what he was doing and why the church would kill him for it, writing that he defied the Pope and all his laws, and that if God spared his life, he would cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scripture than the Pope. And he was killed before he finished his translation, but not before he had completed enough of it that approximately 80% of the King James Bible, published in 1611, is Tyndale's language, meaning that the most widely read book in the English language was substantially written by a man who was strangled and burned for writing it. And the specific phrases that define English language engagement with religious and moral concepts, the salt of the earth, a moment in time, the powers that be, let there be light, gave up the ghost. All of these come from Tyndale's translation, meaning that the man burned for making the Bible accessible to ordinary English people gave English its moral vocabulary. Now Étienne Dolet. In 1546, a French printer and humanist scholar was burned in Paris, and the specific charge against him was atheism, making him the first person in recorded European history to be executed specifically for the crime of not believing in God. And what Dolet had actually done was translate a dialogue attributed to Plato, in which the immortality of the soul was questioned, adding a single phrase to the translation that the censors interpreted as denying the soul's immortality. And the phrase he added was, "Après la mort tu ne seras plus rien," After death, you will be nothing more. And whether Dole added this phrase as a genuine expression of his own belief or as a translation choice has been debated by scholars ever since. But what is not debated is that he was burned for it, and the specific historical significance of Dole's execution is not the individual case, but what it demonstrates about the institutional mechanism for controlling thought in 16th century France. Because Dole was a printer, a man whose professional function was the multiplication and distribution of ideas, and the burning of a printer for a single phrase added to a translation is an institutional statement about the relationship between the printing press and institutional authority that is more revealing than any theological argument. Now, Cecco d'Ascoli. In 1327, an Italian astrologer and physician was burned in Florence, and the specific charge against him was that he had calculated the horoscope of Jesus Christ and determined from astrological principles that the crucifixion had been astrologically inevitable rather than a free act of divine sacrifice. And what Cecco had actually been doing was applying the empirical methods of Arabic astronomy and Aristotelian natural philosophy to questions that the Church had reserved for theological rather than empirical analysis. And his mistake was not the specific conclusion he reached, but the method he applied. Because a method that subjected sacred events to empirical analysis was a method that could not be permitted, regardless of what conclusions it reached. Because the conclusions were less threatening than the method. And Cecco d'Ascoli is almost entirely unknown today because his works were destroyed along with his body, and the historical tradition has had nothing to preserve except the record of his burning. And he is included here not because his specific astronomical conclusions have been vindicated in the way Bruno's cosmology has been vindicated, but because he represents the earliest documented case of someone being burned specifically for applying empirical methods to questions the Church considered theological. Now, Jacques de Molay. In 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned on a small island in the Seine, in Paris. And as the flames rose around him, he reportedly cursed King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V by name, saying that they would both be dead within the year, and both of them were dead within the year. And what de Molay had actually been running for the previous several decades was the most sophisticated banking and logistics network in the medieval world. And what he lost was not simply his life, but the entire institutional infrastructure of an organization that had spent 2 centuries developing financial instruments and intelligence networks and diplomatic relationships that had no equivalent in the medieval world. And the specific reason Philip IV destroyed the Templars was documented in his own financial records, which show that he was deeply in debt to the order and that the confiscation of Templar assets was the most direct available solution to his financial problem. And the charges of heresy and devil worship that provided the legal framework for the destruction were extracted under torture and were recanted by most of the accused, including de Molay himself at his trial. And de Molay's final public recantation of his confession on the scaffold was the specific act that required his immediate execution, because a public recantation in front of a large crowd undermined the entire legal framework that had justified the destruction of the order, and the Templar treasury, which was supposedly confiscated, along with all other Templar assets, was never fully accounted for, and where it went has been the subject of speculation for 7 centuries. Now, Urbain Grandier. In 1634, a French Catholic priest was burned alive in Loudun after being convicted of causing the demonic possession of an entire convent of Ursuline nuns. And the specific political mechanism of his destruction is documented in such extraordinary detail in the surviving records of his trial that it has been the subject of serious historical scholarship, literary treatment by Aldous Huxley, and dramatic treatment by Ken Russell. And what those records show is a man who had made a specific, powerful enemy, Cardinal Richelieu, by writing a pamphlet opposing Richelieu's political policies and by refusing to provide Richelieu with a church appointment he had requested. and the possession outbreak at the convent was genuine in the sense that the nuns were exhibiting dramatic physical and behavioral symptoms. But the specific claim that Grandier had caused the possession through a demonic pact was a legal construction assembled by people with direct connections to Richelieu's political network. And the evidence presented at his trial included a document described as a pact with the devil, signed by Grandier and by several demons, including Lucifer, Satan, and Beelzebub. And the document was signed by the demons in their own handwriting, which the court accepted as authentic evidence. And Grandier maintained his innocence through torture that was documented in clinical detail by the court recorder and was burned maintaining it. And what his case demonstrates is not the specific superstition of his era, but the specific mechanism by which institutional power uses whatever legal and cultural framework is available to it to destroy people who represent political inconveniences. And that mechanism is not specific to the 17th century. Now, Servilio Lucrezia. And the reason to end here with a figure whose name is almost entirely unknown is that she represents the largest and most invisible category of people burned for being right, which is the category of ordinary practitioners whose knowledge was destroyed not through formal trial and formal execution, but through the systematic campaign against popular medical and agricultural knowledge that the witch trials represented at their most fundamental level. Because the historical scholarship of the last 40 years, including the work of Silvia Federici in Caliban and the Witch, has documented that the witch trials of the 15th through 17th centuries were not primarily about religious deviance or demonic pacts, but about the systematic destruction of a body of practical knowledge held primarily by women, knowledge of herbal medicine, of reproductive control, of agricultural practice, of the specific pharmacological properties of plants that the same women who were burned for knowing them had been transmitting across generations for centuries. And what was destroyed in the burning of the women called witches was not superstition, but the accumulated empirical knowledge of generations of practitioners who had been systematically observing the effects of specific plants on specific conditions and transmitting those observations through apprenticeship traditions that the Church classified as demonic instruction. And the pharmaceutical companies that now patent the active compounds of the plants that the burned women knew about are the institutional inheritors of a knowledge transfer that began with the destruction of the people who originally held that knowledge. And if you have watched this entire video and you have not yet subscribed, then subscribe now, because every video on this channel is built around the same specific commitment, which is to show you what actually happened rather than what the official record was designed to make you believe happened. And the like button tells the algorithm that this kind of history deserves to reach more people. And the comment section is where I want to know which of these 10 people surprised you most, because the answer to that question tells me what the next video should be about.